The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the dense forest canopy as Mike Wheeler shouldered his hunting gear and started his trek into the Cascade Mountains. The crisp October air nipped at his nose, and his breath came out in small, visible puffs. He'd been hunting these woods for over 2 decades, and they felt as familiar to him as his own backyard. But today would be different. Today would change his life forever. Mike had always preferred hunting alone. There was something peaceful about the solitude, about being one with nature and listening to the forest wake up around him. The leaves crunched softly beneath his boots as he made his way along his favorite deer trail, stopping occasionally to check for fresh tracks. He'd seen promising signs the evening before, a cluster of broken twigs, fresh droppings, and the telltale marks of deer hooves in the soft earth. The forest was coming alive with its usual morning sounds. Birds called to each other from the treetops, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a hollow tree. Mike knew these sounds by heart. They were the soundtrack to his countless hunting trips. But then something caught his ear, something that didn't belong. At first, it was so faint he thought he might have imagined it. A whimper barely audible over the rustling leaves. Mike froze mid-step, his hunter's instincts kicking in as he listened intently. There it was again. A sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't the cry of any wild animal he knew, and after 20 years in these woods, he knew them all. "That's not right," he muttered to himself, adjusting the direction of his walk. The responsible thing would be to check it out, even if it meant putting his hunting plans on hold. His wife always told him he had a soft heart hidden behind his rugged exterior, and she wasn't wrong. The sound led him off his familiar trail and into thicker undergrowth. Branches caught at his jacket as he pushed through, trying to move quietly despite the dense vegetation. The whimpering grew slightly louder, but now it seemed to come and go, as if whatever was making the sound was growing tired. Mike checked his watch, 7:15 a.m. He'd been walking for about an hour, and the morning fog was finally starting to lift. The temperature was rising too, turning the crisp morning into what promised to be a beautiful autumn day. Under different circumstances, it would have been perfect hunting weather. As he pushed through a particularly thick patch of bushes, his boot caught on something, nearly sending him sprawling. Catching himself on a nearby tree trunk, Mike looked down to see what had tripped him. It was a length of rope, partially buried under fallen leaves. His eyes followed its path through the undergrowth, and his heart began to pound. The rope led to an old oak tree, one of the giants of the forest, and tied to that tree was something that made Mike forget all about his hunting plans. Through the morning mist and branches, he could make out a large shape that shouldn't be there. Not in these woods, not tied to a tree. Mike Wheeler had seen a lot of things in these mountains. He'd encountered bears, helped lost hikers, and even once found an illegal campsite that he'd reported to the rangers. But nothing in his 20 years of experience had prepared him for what he was about to discover. He took a deep breath and gripped his rifle a little tighter, not to use it, but because its familiar weight was reassuring. Then, moving as quietly as his years of hunting had taught him, he began making his way toward the tree. The whimpering had stopped, but now he could hear heavy breathing. Whatever was tied to that tree was alive, and from the sound of it, it was big. The morning sun chose that moment to break through the clouds completely, sending shafts of light through the canopy. As Mike got closer, the scene before him became clearer, and his heart sank into his boots. What he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about human nature. There, tied to the ancient oak with that frayed rope, was a dog. But this wasn't just any lost pet that had wandered too far from home. No, this situation screamed of intentional abandonment, and the sight made Mike's blood boil. The revelation hit him hard. This was just the beginning of what would turn out to be the most extraordinary day of his life. Little did Mike know that this unexpected discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but would uncover secrets that some people had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. As he stood there, processing what he was seeing, he had no idea that he was about to become entangled in something much bigger than a simple case of animal abandonment. The forest seemed to grow quieter around him, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mike Wheeler, longtime hunter and outdoorsman, was about to learn that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones we're looking for, but the ones that find us instead. As Mike drew closer to the tree, the full reality of what he was seeing hit him like a physical blow. The German Shepherd was larger than he'd first thought, though its actual size was hard to tell because of how it was hunched against the tree. Its coat, which should have been thick and glossy, was matted with mud and forest debris. The sight made Mike's chest tighten with a mixture of anger and sadness. The dog's ears perked up as Mike approached, but there was no growling, no signs of aggression. Instead, the animal lifted its head slowly, and Mike found himself looking into a pair of intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold more exhaustion than fear. 20 years of hunting had taught Mike to read animals, and everything about this dog's body language told him it was desperately hoping for help. "Hey there, buddy," Mike called out softly, keeping his voice steady and calm. He'd dealt with injured wildlife before and knew sudden movements or loud noises could spell disaster. But this was different. This was a domestic animal, one that had clearly known human kindness before and human cruelty too, by the looks of it. Moving with deliberate slowness, Mike set his rifle down against a nearby tree, making sure it was well out of reach. The last thing he needed was to spook the dog and have it hurt itself trying to get away. The rope around its neck had already done enough damage, leaving visible marks where it had rubbed against the fur. "You must be thirsty," Mike said, maintaining a gentle conversation as he reached for his canteen. He kept his movements slow and predictable, narrating each action. "I'm just going to get you some water, okay? Nothing to be scared of." The dog's eyes followed his every movement, but its tail gave a slight wag at the sound of his voice. That small gesture told Mike volumes about the animal's nature. Despite whatever hardships it had endured, it still had trust left to give. The thought made his throat tight with emotion. Mike poured some water into his cupped hand and held it out, staying low but not crouching completely, a position that would let him back away quickly if needed. The dog stretched its neck as far as the rope would allow, and Mike's heart broke a little more. He shuffled forward carefully until the water was within reach. The sound of the dog lapping desperately at the water echoed in the quiet forest. Mike noticed how its ribs showed clearly through its fur, how its muscles trembled with exhaustion. He'd seen enough animals in distress to know this one had been here for days, not hours. Who would do something like this? He wondered aloud, his voice thick with emotion. The dog paused its drinking to look at him, water dripping from its muzzle. There was something in that look that went beyond simple animal gratitude. It was as if the dog was trying to tell him something. Mike used the opportunity to really study his surroundings. The ground around the tree was scattered with fallen leaves, but he could see where the dog had worn a semicircle in the dirt, pacing as far as its tether would allow. There were no food wrappers, no signs that whoever left the dog had intended for it to survive. But something else caught his eye, the dog's collar. It wasn't a cheap nylon one you'd find at a pet store. This was expensive leather, well worn but quality made. The kind of collar a cherished pet would wear. And there was something attached to it that didn't look like a typical ID tag. The morning sun had fully risen now, filtering through the canopy and creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds had resumed their morning songs, and somewhere nearby, a squirrel chattered indignantly at the intrusion into its domain. But Mike barely noticed any of it. His focus was entirely on the mystery before him. He offered more water, which the dog accepted gratefully. As it drank, Mike spoke softly, sharing his thoughts out loud. "You're not some abandoned stray, are you? Someone cared for you. Something doesn't add up here." The dog's ears twitched at his words, and again Mike had that uncanny feeling that the animal understood more than a dog should. Moving closer, inch by inch, Mike could now see that the dog's paws were well maintained, with neatly trimmed nails. Another sign this was no ordinary stray. Despite its current state, this dog had been someone's well-cared-for companion. The question was, what had happened to bring it here? The rope around its neck told one story, a tale of abandonment and cruelty. But the expensive collar and well-groomed stay told another. Mike had tracked enough animals to know that when signs contradicted each other, there was usually more to the story than met the eye. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that he was about to uncover something far more complex than simple animal cruelty. The German Shepherd watching him with those intelligent eyes was more than just an abandoned pet. It was a messenger carrying secrets that some people would do anything to keep hidden. As Mike prepared to deal with the rope, he had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to pull him into a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his quiet mountain community. Sometimes, he would later reflect, the biggest stories start with the smallest acts of compassion. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Mike continued to gain the German Shepherd's trust. He'd been offering water and gentle words for about 15 minutes now, and the dog's initial wariness had given way to cautious acceptance. Every few minutes, its eyes would dart to the surrounding forest, as if expecting someone or something to appear. "Easy there, big guy," Mike soothed, noticing how the dog's ears perked up at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Having spent countless hours in these woods, Mike knew the normal sounds of the forest, but even he found himself becoming more alert, infected by the dog's obvious anxiety. As he edged closer, Mike could now clearly see what had caught his attention earlier. There was indeed something unusual attached to the dog's collar. It wasn't a normal ID tag, but rather what appeared to be a small waterproof bag, the kind photographers use to protect their memory cards. It had been carefully secured with zip ties, positioned in a way that wouldn't bother the dog, but would keep the contents safe and dry. "What have you got there, boy?" Mike murmured, more to himself than the dog. His heart rate picked up slightly. Something about this whole situation felt increasingly strange. Well-cared-for dogs don't just end up tied to trees in remote forests, and they certainly don't come with mysterious waterproof packages attached to their collars. The dog watched him intently as he slowly reached toward the collar. Mike kept his movements deliberate and gentle, continuously talking in a low, soothing voice. "I'm just going to take a look at this, okay? Not going to hurt you. That's a good boy." His fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against the waterproof bag. The material was high quality, the kind used for serious outdoor gear. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure whatever was inside would survive the elements. The zip ties had been applied carefully too, tight enough to secure the package, but not so tight as to cause the dog any discomfort. "Someone really wanted to make sure this stayed safe," Mike commented, his mind racing with possibilities. In all his years of hunting, he'd seen some strange things in these woods. Abandoned camps, old equipment, even once a stash of weather equipment that turned out to belong to a local university. But this was different. This felt deliberate. Planned. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the cool forest air. Drops of dew sparkled on spider webs strewn between branches, and somewhere nearby, a pair of cicadas called back and forth. The peaceful scene stood in stark contrast to the mystery unfolding before him. Mike checked his phone again, still no signal, as expected in this remote area. He was on his own with whatever he was about to discover. With careful fingers, he began working on the zip ties. He had a multi-tool in his hunting vest, and he retrieved it slowly, showing it to the dog before proceeding. "Just going to cut this off, buddy. Nice and easy." The dog remained surprisingly calm, almost as if it understood the importance of what Mike was doing. Those intelligent brown eyes never left his hands as he worked. The zip ties fell away with 2 careful snips, and Mike gently removed the waterproof bag from the collar. It was lighter than he expected, but definitely contained something. Through the clear material, he could make out what looked like paper and something else, something that caught the sunlight with a metallic gleam. Mike's hands were steady now, years of hunting having taught him to control his nerves, but his mind was racing. What could be so important that someone would go to these lengths? Why use a dog as a messenger? And most importantly, what had he just stumbled into? The forest seemed to grow quieter around him, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The dog sat patiently, watching, waiting. Its earlier anxiety seemed to have faded, replaced by an almost expectant air, as if it had been waiting for someone, anyone, to find this package. Looking at the waterproof bag in his hands, Mike had a sudden crystal-clear realization. Opening this package would change everything. Whatever was inside had been important enough for someone to risk a beloved pet to deliver it. Important enough to ensure it would survive rain, wind, and weather until it was found. The German Shepherd let out a soft whine, almost encouraging. Its tail gave a slight wag, and it nudged Mike's hand with its nose, the first voluntary contact it had initiated. The gesture seemed to say, "Go on, that's what I've been waiting for." Mike took a deep breath, holding the package up to the filtered sunlight streaming through the canopy. He could feel that he was standing on the edge of something big, something that went far beyond a simple morning hunting trip or even a rescued dog. Whatever was in this package had a story to tell, and somehow he knew it was a story that needed to be heard. With one last look at his newfound companion, Mike prepared to open the mysterious package. The sounds of the forest faded into the background as he focused on the task at hand, unaware that he was about to become part of something much larger than himself, a story that would shake their quiet mountain community to its core. Time seemed to move differently now as Mike checked his surroundings with newfound alertness. The peaceful morning forest had transformed into something more ominous, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs carrying new meaning. He knew these mountains better than most, but suddenly they felt different, like familiar streets do when you realize you're being followed. "All right, Rex, we need to move," Mike said softly, checking his hunting vest to make sure the waterproof package was secure. He pulled out his trail mix and offered some to Rex, who accepted it gratefully. The dog's ribs showed clearly through his fur, but there was strength in his stance now, as if being freed and having his mission acknowledged had given him new energy. Mike quickly ran through his options. His truck was about 2 hours away by his usual route, but that path crossed several open areas. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't think twice about it, but normal circumstances didn't involve carrying evidence of criminal activity while potentially being watched. "We're going to take the long way, buddy," he told Rex, pulling out his compass. There was an old deer trail he'd discovered years ago that stuck to denser cover. It would add an hour to their journey, but it offered better protection. "Think you can handle that?" Rex's response was to stand closer to Mike, alert and ready. Despite his exhausted state, the German Shepherd's training was evident in how he positioned himself, slightly behind and to Mike's right, perfect position for following while staying out of the way. They began their journey through the dense forest, Mike constantly scanning their surroundings. Every skill he'd learned in 20 years of hunting came into play, reading the ground for signs of recent passage, checking the behavior of local wildlife, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The morning sun climbed higher as they made their way through the undergrowth. Mike kept their pace steady but not too fast, mindful of Rex's condition. Every 15 minutes, he'd stop to offer water and check on his new companion. The dog moved with surprising grace despite his exhaustion, following Mike's lead without hesitation. About an hour into their trek, something made Mike freeze. Rex tensed beside him, ears forward. Somewhere ahead, a flock of birds erupted from the trees, not the casual dispersal of birds seeking food, but the sudden flight of startled creatures. "Down," Mike whispered, dropping into a crouch behind a fallen log. Rex immediately flattened himself beside Mike, not making a sound. They waited, barely breathing, as the forest settled around them. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, a distant engine sound reached their ears, an ATV, moving fast through the woods where no vehicles were allowed. Mike's heart pounded as the sound faded away. Someone else was out here, someone who wasn't supposed to be. He looked at Rex, seeing his own tension reflected in the dog's alert posture. "Good boy," he whispered, patting Rex's head. "You've done this before, haven't you?" The next hour was a careful dance through the forest. Mike chose their path with meticulous care, using every trick he knew to avoid leaving obvious signs of their passage. They crossed streams when possible, used rocky ground that wouldn't hold footprints, and stuck to the densest cover available. Rex proved to be an invaluable partner. Twice more he alerted to sounds Mike hadn't caught, giving them time to hide as more vehicles passed in the distance. The dog's military-grade training was obvious now. Whoever his owner was had prepared him well for this kind of situation. As they moved, Mike's mind raced with questions. How many people were involved in this operation? How long had it been going on? Most importantly, what had happened to Rex's owner? The shaky handwriting on the note suggested they'd been under immense stress, possibly injured. The sun was almost directly overhead when they finally caught sight of the logging road where Mike had parked his truck. But he didn't feel relief yet. The last stretch was often the most dangerous. They waited in the cover of thick bushes, watching and listening for 10 full minutes before Mike was satisfied it was safe to move. "Almost there, buddy," Mike encouraged Rex, who was showing signs of fatigue but remained determinedly at his side. The dog's loyalty was incredible. Even after days of being tied to a tree, he'd found the strength to help protect the evidence he'd been entrusted with. The final 100 yards to the truck were the longest of Mike's life. Every step felt exposed, every sound too loud. His keys were already in his hand, ready for a quick exit. Rex stayed close, his body language shifting between exhaustion and alertness. When they finally reached the truck, Mike quickly helped Rex into the passenger seat. The dog settled in as if he'd been riding shotgun his whole life, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Mike started the engine with shaking hands, the familiar rumble bringing the first real sense of safety he'd felt in hours. As they pulled onto the main forest road, Mike glanced at his quiet companion. "You did good, Rex, really good. Now let's make sure your owner's brave actions weren't for nothing." The German shepherd's tail thumped against the seat in response, and his intelligent eyes seemed to hold both relief and determination. The morning's hunting trip had turned into something far more important. In his vest pocket, the waterproof package felt heavy with responsibility. Mike knew that once they reached cell phone range, their real challenges would begin. But for now, with Rex safe beside him and the evidence secure, he allowed himself to feel a small measure of accomplishment. They'd won this round, but Mike had a feeling their story was far from over. The first cell phone signal bars appeared on Mike's phone just as they turned onto the main highway. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, but his heart was racing as he pulled into the parking lot of the local diner, a place he trusted, owned by people he'd known for years. "Wait here, buddy," Mike told Rex, who was still alertly watching their surroundings. He cracked the windows and locked the truck, then walked quickly into the diner. The familiar bell chimed as he entered, and the owner, Bob, looked up from behind the counter. "Mike, thought you'd be out hunting all day. Everything okay?" Bob's friendly smile faded as he saw Mike's expression. 20 years of friendship meant he could read the tension in Mike's face. "Need to use your office phone, Bob. It's important." Mike's tone must have conveyed the urgency because Bob simply nodded and led him to the small office in the back, no questions asked. Mike's first call was to the local authorities, not just the regular dispatch number, but a direct line to Chief Thompson, whose card he'd kept after helping with a lost hiker search last summer. As he waited for the call to connect, Mike watched through the office window as Rex sat vigilantly in the truck, still performing his duty. "Thompson here," came the gruff voice over the line. "Chief, it's Mike Wheeler. I've got something you need to see. Found it up in the North Range. Involves wildlife trafficking, possibly more. And I've got a dog here who's part of the story." There was a pause on the line. "Wheeler? The hunter? Stay where you are. Don't tell anyone else about this. I'll be there in 20. The next call was to the local animal control officer, Lynn, who Mike knew from his volunteer work at the shelter. Rex needed medical attention, and Lynn was someone he trusted to be discreet. While waiting, Mike bought a bowl of the diner's beef stew and brought it out to Rex. The dog ate carefully, mannerly despite his obvious hunger, never letting his guard down completely. Mike couldn't help but admire the animal's training and dedication. Exactly 18 minutes later, 2 unmarked police vehicles pulled into the lot, followed by Lynn's animal control truck. Chief Thompson emerged from the first vehicle, and Mike recognized the woman who stepped out of the second car. Agent Chen from the state's Environmental Crimes Unit. He'd met her last year during a workshop on spotting illegal hunting operations. The next hour was a blur of activity, all handled with careful discretion. Lynn checked over Rex while Mike briefed the officers, showing them the contents of the waterproof package. Agent Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as she examined the photos and the USB drive. "This is bigger than we thought," she said finally, looking up from the evidence. "We've had suspicions about activity in this area, but nothing concrete until now. Your friend here," she nodded toward Rex, "and his owner may have just given us the break we've been waiting for." The diner's back office became a temporary command center. More officials arrived quietly. A forensics expert, a wildlife specialist, and 2 more state agents. They worked efficiently, documenting everything while keeping a low profile to avoid drawing attention. Mike watched as they carefully copied the USB drive's contents. The files revealed a detailed operation, mapped locations, shipping schedules, financial records. Rex's owner had been thorough, documenting everything with the precision of someone who knew the information needed to be bulletproof. "The GPS data from these photos matches suspicious locations we've been monitoring," Agent Chen explained, pointing to a map they'd spread across Bob's desk. But we could never get close enough to gather evidence. Your mystery photographer managed to get what we couldn't. 3 months had passed since that fateful October morning when Mike found Rex tied to a tree. The winter snow now blanketed the mountains, transforming the forest into a quiet wonderland. But beneath that peaceful surface, a lot had changed. The evidence Rex had carried led to one of the largest wildlife trafficking busts in the state's history. Over 6 weeks of careful surveillance and coordination between multiple agencies, the operation came to a head in a series of pre-dawn raids. 6 key members of the trafficking ring were arrested, and dozens more were identified and tracked across state lines. Mike sat in his living room, watching Rex sprawled comfortably by the fireplace. The German Shepherd had transformed from the desperate messenger he'd found in the woods into a healthy, happy dog. His coat was now glossy and thick, perfect for the winter weather, and his eyes held a contentment that warmed Mike's heart. "You've earned this, buddy," Mike said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the floor in response, but his ears still perked up at every sound from outside. Some habits never changed. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Rex's story. His owner had been an environmental researcher conducting legitimate studies in the mountains when they stumbled upon the trafficking operation. Instead of looking the other way, they spent months gathering evidence, carefully documenting the criminal activities. But someone had discovered their surveillance. When things got dangerous, they made the incredible decision to trust their beloved dog with all the evidence they'd gathered. They knew Rex had the training and intelligence to survive until someone found him, and the loyalty to protect his precious cargo. The researcher had been found too, though not in time to save them. They'd managed to reach a remote ranger station, but their injuries were too severe. Their last words had been about their dog, hoping he'd completed his mission. At least now they could rest knowing their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Mike's role hadn't ended with finding Rex. His knowledge of the mountains proved invaluable during the investigation. He helped the authorities identify remote locations, guided them through challenging terrain, and provided insights that only someone with decades of experience in these woods could offer. Agent Chen had kept him updated throughout the process. The trafficking ring had been operating for years, using the remote mountain locations to move endangered species and other illegal cargo. The evidence Rex carried had provided the crucial links they needed, connecting local operations to international networks. "Your buddy here changed everything," Chief Thompson had told Mike during their last meeting. "We've shut down similar operations in 3 other states based on the information we uncovered. Rex's owner gave us the key to something much bigger than we imagined." The adoption papers lay on Mike's coffee table, officially signed and approved last week. Rex was now legally his, though in truth, they'd belonged to each other since that morning in the forest. The bond forged during their careful journey back to safety had only grown stronger with time. Mike's wife had fallen in love with Rex immediately, despite her initial concerns about adopting a dog with such a complicated past. "He's not just a dog," she'd said after their first week together. "He's a hero who needs a home." Rex had won her over completely when he started gently herding their young daughter away from any potential dangers around the house. The German Shepherd's military and police training showed in unexpected ways. He still patrolled the property every morning and evening, checking the perimeter with the same dedication he'd shown during his time as a surveillance dog. But now he also played fetch in the backyard, cuddled on the couch during movie nights, and had become an integral part of their family. Mike's hunting trips had taken on a new dimension with Rex by his side. The dog's incredible sense of smell and tactical training made them an exceptional team in the woods. But more importantly, they shared a special connection from their shared experience, an understanding that went beyond words. The local community had changed too. The arrests had shocked many people who'd never suspected what was happening in their quiet mountain town. But it had also brought them closer together. Neighbors looked out for each other more, reported suspicious activities, and worked to protect the wilderness they all loved. Rex's story had made national news, though Mike had kept their family out of the spotlight. The case had led to new legislation strengthening penalties for wildlife trafficking and increased funding for environmental law enforcement. Rex had even received a special commendation from the governor, though he seemed more interested in the treats at the ceremony than the medal. "You know what, Rex?" Mike said, settling down on the floor beside his dog. "Sometimes the best things in life come from doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Rex lifted his head and looked at Mike with those intelligent brown eyes that had first caught his attention in the forest. Then he scooted closer, resting his head on Mike's lap. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. The mountains stood silent and strong, their forests now a little safer thanks to one brave researcher and their incredibly loyal dog. Mike ran his hand along Rex's back, feeling the strong, healthy muscles that had replaced the desperate thinness of that October morning. They'd both changed since that day. Mike had discovered a courage he didn't know he had, and Rex had found a new purpose and a loving home. "We did good, buddy," Mike whispered. "We did real good." Rex's tail thumped against the floor in agreement, and together they watched the fire's warm glow fill their home with light.